welcome to CogX, to the economy and the future of work stage. I'm delighted to introduce you to our next event, which is Making the Most of a Crisis, Social Capital Made Digital, featuring Anne-Marie Imafidon of Stemettes in the Future of Work Commission and Andy Haldane from the Bank of England. If you want to tweet about the event or anything that you hear is really interesting to you, please make use of the Slido question and answer function, and hopefully Anne-Marie and Andy will get the opportunity to respond to some of your questions and comments. And also please consider tweeting at CogX 2020, or consider tweeting on our partner Institute for the Future of Work's profile at _Future of Work. Thank you very much, and I really hope that you enjoy the session. Handing over now to Anne-Marie and Andy to kick off.
Thank you very much, Nasha. So welcome all of you to this session on the economy and future of work stage at 2020 CogX from myself, Anne-Marie Imafidon. I am leading this session called Making the Most of Crisis, Social Capital Made Digital. And we were given 3 sentences to kind of guide us through this discussion today, Andy and I. Sentence 1 was volunteering in the third sector. Sentence 2 was building social capital, and the third one was extending, revaluing key and unpaid work. So we're hoping that we're going to be able to deliver all that was promised and that you're here for. So joining me is Andy Haldane, who you can see on that side of the screen, who is the Chief Economist at the Bank of England. He's a member of the bank's Monetary Policy Committee, and he's also chair of the government's Industrial Strategy Council. So very hopefully be able to offer a lot of insight, but I know he'll be able to offer a lot of insights under this umbrella that we have of social capital made digital. And for any of you that are CogX regulars, you might recognize a session like this from last year. This is our kind of first year anniversary, actually, Andy, of the fourth industrial revolution. What does it mean for the economy and the charity sector? And it feels like we're living in a different lifetime from the one that we were in when we hit the stage in 2019. So much has happened since CogX last year. And a little bit more about me, just as before we get started. I am CEO and co-founder at Stemettes and charity director at Stemettes Futures, which are both organisations in the third sector, working to empower and inspire girls, young women and non-binary people into the STEM sectors, that being science, technology, engineering and maths. We have a lot of volunteers and we rely on quite a lot of social capital. And I'm also a trustee at the Institute for the Future of Work, who have convened this stage. So end up looking at ideas around social capital and building the future and particularly work. And there's lots of ideas that we have and papers that we've put out. And of course, we're curating this stage across the three days. So very excited to do that. And the reason why I'm able to host this, I'm a host, I'm a speaker. You might know me from the Evening Standard Women Tech Charge podcast. So I get to speak a lot. And so really excited to delve into this conversation today. Andy, any opening words you'd like before I hit you with a couple of questions?
Well, just to say hello. Hello again, Anne-Marie. It's great to be back at CogX. It's great to be back being interviewed by you. Welcome, everyone. I look forward to being grilled like last year.
Perfect. Right. So without further ado, I'm going to start with a quote from yourself, actually, Andy. There's lots that you've been putting out as Chief Economist of the Bank of England. One that I think is quite relevant, actually impressive for what we're speaking about today, is that the very reason you say that you got into economics and into public policy was because of the scarring experience of the early 80s unemployment. And this is something that we're looking at. This is a context within which we're wanting to talk about social capital. You know, we're in lockdown, we're in this pandemic. There's quite a lot economically that's happening as a result of it. How does what we're going through now, kind of causes and impact, differ from what we had in the 80s?
Yeah, well, thanks, Anne-Marie. Let me have a go with that. I mean, this is different in of course, one crucial respect, which is the epicenter of this crisis is an epidemic. It's a public health crisis. And in dealing with that, we're having to impose measures that mean we're compounding the health crisis with an economic crisis on top. We've seen activity across the economy collapse, and we've seen a rapid rise in inactivity among workers, both people being made unemployed, but as importantly, 8 million people underemployed due to furlough scheme. So that's a level of inactivity in the jobs market we haven't seen possibly ever. We also know that the costs of that are being felt quite unevenly across society. We know that those most likely to have their incomes cut and perhaps even their jobs cut are lower paid people, lower skilled people, women, and of course the young. And that's the sense in which there's a risk, at least, that this time's crisis could have some echoes of the one you mentioned in the early 1980s. Most of you, certainly you, Anne-Marie, are far too young to remember that, but I regrettably am not. And that had a scarring experience on me. I was at school at the time. Okay. There was a time when, more than 3 million people across the UK were without jobs. And crucially, many of them were young and had the jobs ladder kicked away for them, not just for 1 year, but for many years, and in some cases for a whole lifetime. So for me, one of the crucial things now is to learn the lesson from the 1980s and not to risk a repeat of not just that youth unemployment, but lasting youth unemployment that can leave scars that last a lifetime and perhaps even a generation.
And I think there's lessons to learn, but also we've got the privilege, maybe if we can call it that, of being in this digital age, as it were. So the access to technology, though not total, is one that might be able to kind of maybe help soothe some of the outcomes that we're seeing. Before we go on to my kind of next line of questions, what would be the biggest learning, I'd say, for our next steps? So with the benefit of the hindsight, all right, a benefit of experience from the 1980s, what's the biggest learning you'd say we need to make sure that we're conscious of and that we apply to any actions that we have now?
Well, I think a big one would be that it's alarming how quickly your skills depreciate when you are out of the world of work. And particularly in the area of digital skills, where we start with a big deficit to begin with, those skills are going to atrophy incredibly quickly, such is the pace of change. So for me, it's absolutely crucial that if people do find themselves on the sidelines from the world of work for a period, they have some means of keeping their skills fresh, keeping their skills updated to ease their transition back into the world of work. And that means not leaving people out of work and out of skills for 12 months, more than that. And the depreciation rate really does pick up. So that would be my one key takeaway. It's almost a word of warning, isn't it, really, to anyone that might find themselves, by the wayside or impacted in any way, is to keep at them, I guess, keep skill building despite what's going on. Well, it's a word of warning to us as individuals, but also a word of warning to us as policymakers and to us as society. We need to make means available for people to find training opportunities easily and locally and cheaply. And entering this crisis at the start of the year, we knew that even then, half the workforce across the UK didn't have, for example, the digital skills they needed to do their job well. One of the very small, perhaps silver linings of the past couple of months is that all of us, or many of us, have had to improve our digital skills of necessity to get on events like today. But almost there's a big building job to be done, and especially for those who are new to the world of work. And that's a responsibility for individuals, but as importantly, it's a responsibility for policymakers as well.
So there's a great question that's come in that kind of points to where we're going to head next, actually, in this discussion. So this is, what's the interaction between the current crisis and existing inequalities? So just to kind of add some statistics into what we're saying, when we talk about digital skills and the prevalence of digital skills, 4 in 10 benefits claimants have very low digital engagement. So that's the kind of for those that were not even underemployed but on benefits. 16% of consumers are unable to use the internet by themselves, and this is from the Lloyd's Digital Index, and 7% of people are completely offline. And with this question, I think we also have to think about the geographical inequalities. We can think of racial inequalities. We can think of social inequalities. So there's quite a lot to layer on. And what would be your answer? What's been the interaction between the current crisis and those existing inequalities?
Well, I mean, it seems extremely likely from all the evidence I've seen, all the analysis that I've done, that pre-existing inequality, they could be income, they could be opportunity, they could be wealth, they could be spatial, regional around the country. All of those and a few more besides are likely to be made worse as a result of this crisis having struck, because the burden of joblessness, the burden of inactivity, the disruption to lifestyles, to lives, to incomes is greatest for those in the poorest parts of the country, in insecure work of various types, and with the lowest savings and the lowest levels of income. So there's no question this crisis, as with many crises in the past, will actually worsen what are already pretty hefty levels of inequality across the country.
So so there's lots that we need to consider as we plan to build and create. So the topic of this session was about social capital gone digital. This notion of social capital, I think the reason why it's something we wanted to hit on was because, when we think about all the different types of capital versus a pandemic, there is that capital trend where, the capital on which capitalism is built has been eroded. The human capital has been depreciated, as we're talking about skills. Economies are kind of very much struggling, and we've got financial capital being depressed. These are your words being paraphrased. But social capital has been the one that bucks that pandemic trend, right? We've got this kind of social distancing versus social strengthening that we've got on our hands.
Absolutely. Yeah, you've parroted them much better than I did, Anne-Marie. Absolutely. And we've seen it at times of the past, right? At times of societal stress, the one capital, inverted commas, that stands tall is social capital. That those bonds of trust, those social networks, those communities, those acts of neighbourliness kick in. And we've seen that, haven't we, in spades over the past few months, that despite all the distress, despite all the loss of life and the loss of income, communities have come together. Neighbours have started talking to one another,
clapping with each other on a Thursday evening,
clapping with each other, and talking and socialising, and community WhatsApp groups have emerged, and people have volunteered who've never volunteered previously, including, of course, that almost 750,000 people who volunteered for the NHS. Charities, those helping out at charities have increased hugely. So we've seen this wellspring, this uprising of social togetherness at the very time social distancing, so-called policies, have been put in place, as we have seen at times in the past. And thank heavens for that. So I think without that, things would have been a whole load worse than they have been. I suppose of my many learnings from that, apart from applauding that having happened, is to think, Anne-Marie, about how best we sort of bottle that endowment of social capital for the future. We've discovered something important about ourselves, or rediscovered something important. The value of human interaction, the value of acting as a community, the act of giving up your own time to support someone else. How do we ensure that after the crisis has passed, some of that social capital is built upon, is invested wisely for the future, so we keep on preserving and building it after the COVID crisis has dissipated?
So I think it's built upon, which is hopefully where we'll be able to talk about the role of digital in this. But the other worry or the concern that I have is around how do we now value this work. So I think that we're all kind of, we realised very quickly what key workers were, right? And the fact that, whether the NHS was unfunded or even just the care system is something that we'd initially looked down on. Even this term low skilled is something that we're still trying to play with now, whether, should low skilled equal low paid, because low skilled at this point has equaled quite often key worker. So do you feel like, in addition to building, that we're maybe ready to start having those discussions, or start having that look at how do we reevaluate the value that we place on community, on caring roles, and on this unpaid labour, which I know for anyone that listened in on this conversation last year, we spoke quite a lot about valuing unpaid labour, about, having that be counted towards GDP or any of those other places. So do you feel like where we might end up getting to a place where that's something we can do?
I think the contours of that debate were already shifting a bit, Anne-Marie, ahead of the COVID crisis. But I absolutely hope and expect too that the crisis might give the giddy up to how we keep score as a society. Because you're right, if you're an economist like me, your key metric for keeping score on success would be a measure such as GDP, which, simply put, is how much you are paid. Your value to the economy is measured, very roughly, very proximately by the amount you are paid. This crisis has absolutely made clear that when push comes to shove, in situations of stress, there can be a complete disconnect between the amount by which someone is paid and the value that they are contributing to society. You mentioned healthcare, you mentioned social care, you could mention travel, you could go across the piece actually. The reliance we have placed on all cohorts of workers who are, generally speaking, not all that well paid has been very striking. And of course, that's before you even get to that army of volunteers who score 0 in the GDP national accounts, which somehow feels completely wrong. So the point here is a very general one. That when it comes to issues of social capital, one capital that's stood tall during this crisis, it is currently not recognized or measured at all in most of our off-the-shelf metrics of economic and societal success, and begs the question, how could that possibly be? And could we not find a better way of capturing the contribution people make, including interpersonally, as well as financially? For example, there's a whole stream of work, and we're seeing this finding favour in some countries around the world, that look to measures of well-being, of happiness, in addition to measures of income or GDP, when keeping score and setting policies. And perhaps that's an avenue of travel for us to consider more seriously off the back of this crisis.
Brilliant. So we are at Cognition X. This is about AI. This is about the future. This is about technology. We've maybe not spent enough time talking about technology. So there's a great question here. How can we create digital social innovations to build network power for truth, justice, equity, freedom, and planetary health? So I think let's talk about that conceptually, and then we have a couple of examples that we wanted to speak to that are maybe kind of good starts on this. So how do we create digital social innovations to build that network power?
Yeah, well, I think it's worth asking first, in terms of what the tools can help us achieve, to first ask, what does we want to achieve in the first place? And there's 2 aspects of this I think are really important, 2 M's. One is mobilization, the second is matching. So absolutely, we should be harnessing the power of networks, digital networks, to mobilize many more people to contribute in their many and various shapes and forms. I mentioned the NHS volunteers, look at Clap for Carers, look at Black Lives Matter. This is a means of almost instantaneously mobilizing mass support for a good or great cause and putting people to work energized and mobilized. To some extent, the kit for that exists already, but absolutely we should ensure that that kit reaches every 4 corner of the planet, whether the cause is green, healthcare, race, or whatever it might be. And the second M is matching, because I think the key here is to try and best harness the skills that people have. people, if you are to volunteer, it's important your skills are made best use of, are matched into the best possible opportunity. And here too is a place where technology, where platform solutions can be transformational.
And interestingly, I think to the kind of there's the matching. I think we spoke as well previously about what happens in the private sector, right? I think there's elements of, there are a lot of things that we should learn in terms of the gig economy and all the impact that's had, but ultimately it is still the idea of matching, right? So how do we empower the third sector and the public sector to be able to do that? So sorry, continue. I just wanted to add in that.
No, that's absolutely spot on.
Yeah.
That we know, particularly in the public and third sectors, as you say, that their degree of digital penetration, their digital infrastructure, if you like, is undercooked massively. I mean, look at those 750,000 NHS volunteers who, by and large, were not put to work. Their skills were not matched into positions in the NHS. That endowment of social capital in that case risked being squandered because the digital infrastructure was not in place to best match them into positions that needed carrying out. So I think for public and third in particular, there needs to be a transformation of how we think of building their digital backbone in a way that causes social capital to flourish, which mobilizes more of this new model army of volunteers energized by the stresses of the past couple of months.
And it's interesting talking about skills there. So we've got people we want to mobilize. There's matching we want to do on skills and on resources. And there's a question that came in earlier from David Scott to say, is anyone considering the need for a phased return to work for individuals who may have been furloughed for 6 months by the time restrictions ended? I wanted to kind of just swerve a little bit away from that for a couple of minutes because we're on our countdown now rather than the count up time-wise, and say, are there kind of two examples of that mobilise and match digitally that we can point to, or that we want to say, this is what good could look like, and these are things that are already in flight?
Well, I think a great digital example of how to recognise and reward, say, volunteering effort would be an initiative that's set up a few years ago north of the border in Scotland now. It's a digital identity card for young people that records not just their name and age, but also the amount of volunteering activity that they carry out. It's a volunteering passport, if you like. And it also rewards those young people for carrying out that volunteering activity. So you have a sort of digital passport and a digital currency attached to this worthy social capital creating set of activities. There is no equivalent of that south of the border in England, but it's eminently feasible technically to deliver something like that. In fact, you could amp this up and say, why stop at young people? You would want, I think, you would hope that volunteering, charitable pursuits are a lifelong endeavor in and alongside your career. So why not set up a digital passport that is lifelong and digital credits that are lifelong, and indeed a lifelong program of what you might call national civic service. What better time than now to mobilize people to that cause, given the stress they've seen?
So at this point, I want to open up a poll. We have a poll ready for you as the audience, because it's not just about me and Andy having a great chit chat. We want to hear from you too. So I'm asking the producers or whoever in the background that is there to pop up our poll on the Slido. So you should be able to access this maybe within it. There we go, it's live. And I think 6 of you have voted, brilliant. Would you join this national civic service if your circumstances change? So I'm going to see if I can see the answer. I can't quite see the response to the poll, so I'm hoping someone will be able to share that with me. But while people are voting, I think I've always endorsed lifelong learning and this idea of picking up skills continuously. It's something that also, I obviously do for young people with Stemettes and with my work at Stemettes, but at the Institute for Future of Work, it's something that we definitely know as the world changes as we enter into this fourth industrial revolution, as we're calling it. The idea of reskilling and retraining and being upwardly mobile in the roles and the jobs that you're doing is something that is going to be needed anyway with a lot of the displacements of jobs. Another question, and so that answers one of the questions that we had coming earlier that said, how can we overcome tech inequalities if digital skills are not routinely taught in school? Yeah, it's something we're going to have to continue doing even beyond school. So just looking at this poll, we've got 83% said they would join. So that's a good bit of upkeep there. It's 84% now. So thank you very much to the 60 or so of you who have voted. So we've got, we know there's appetite. I guess we can take that, a very poor sample maybe of people that have Cognition X tickets and have decided to join this session. While we're still voting, so the votes are still coming in. Another question from Eva, who's asked, do you envisage access to university becoming more expensive due to lost international students? When I don't know that we've necessarily got the time to cover that on this session, but we're hosting a panel on this stage tomorrow called Generation COVID at 12. And I know for definite this is one of the things we're going to be talking about, kind of university for all, vocational training for all, education for all, and how do we keep it open. And I think I wanted to kind of bring our conversation to, oh yes, go ahead.
I should say, just on, I mean, this matches, I think, well with your comments about lifelong learning, because we have had, you know, this sort of a third education work retirement model, which has long since disappeared. And the notion that you'd intersperse bits of learning throughout your career, and indeed intersperse bits of volunteering throughout your career. I mean, that is the new, more modular world of work I think we need to be moving towards. And that includes modular approach to education. That, you know, at one level, it makes no sense to have to go away for big blocks of time to university, say, rather than building up those skills over a longer, more modular, perhaps digital means, you know, over the course of a career. And that, maybe this will be the prompt to think afresh about how we supply education services in this more arm's length digital modular fashion that better matches our need for lifelong learning.
I think I love the idea as well of that being linked to the volunteering, and also I guess, you know, as we said, this idea of skills depreciating, the fact that it's something that is not just for people who necessarily want to advance themselves and see necessarily that value of education, but having it as a habit, a force of habit and a way of living for everyone would definitely help with our resilience coming out of this, would definitely help with kind of actually showing quite a lot more of the value that you can even get in this kind of renewed social capital system. I love that, you know, that there is that. I mean, there's a couple of people that voted no down, so we've gone down to 83%. But I like that the appetite is there. So if this was something that was posited, it might end up growing legs. Just wanted to kind of point across to there's a US initiative called the Politics of Care. So at the Institute for Future of Work, we've been looking into this and saying, actually, you know, maybe we should be running a consultation shortly on a community help and work core, maybe, that would combine jobs and training guarantees with voluntary work in the community, that would initially be for contact tracing and, you know, all the things that we're dealing with now, but eventually might end up being, you know, incredibly localized, but work within communities to target pressing local needs.
I think that's a fantastic idea, and you know, and you could then extend that model, Anne-Marie, to issues sectors beyond health and social care, which are obviously crucially important ones. I mean, thinking back, you know, back in the 30s, Roosevelt in the United States at the time of the Great Depression, part of his New Deal was a civilian conservation corps, which is basically environmental activism for young people. That could be dusted off and brought in now as a set of, you know, young environmental corps helping to freeze, retrofit houses and commercial buildings, working as social distance officers. There's a whole world of socially purposed and environmental projects out there that could, as I say, mobilize this new model army of volunteers, capitalize on that social capital and goodwill, and give people, crucially, the skills they need, which aren't just technical. I mean, the digital is crucial, but the social is every bit as important for the future world of work.
Exactly.
And there's no better way of fine-tuning your social skills than through this sort of social action or social sector activity.
Perfect. So there we go. I think we've run out of time, unfortunately. That countdown came at us very quickly. Thank you to all of you for tuning in. Thank you to Andy for your time, and CognitionX for having us on the stage. Let's continue the chat. Let's continue the discussion. Let's go towards the action. So tweet @_future of work to continue on with this, and see you all soon. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you. Thanks, Anne-Marie.
Nice, thank you.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.